The compliance department at Varden Capital occupied the 14th floor of a building that had been designed to feel permanent. The carpet was a shade of gray that absorbed sound, the ceilings were low enough to feel deliberate, and the windows looked out over a street that moved slowly enough to watch. Marcus Hale had worked in that room for 11 years, and in that time he had developed the particular kind of attention that comes not from suspicion, but from proximity. He noticed things because he was positioned to notice them. His role was audit coordination, which meant that every document moving through the investment division passed through a review process that he managed. He did not approve transactions. He did not advise on positions. He sat at the point where the paperwork arrived, was checked, and was filed. The system was not glamorous, but it was precise, and Marcus understood precision the way other people understood conversation. He arrived each morning at 10 minutes to 8, placed his bag on the left side of his desk, and opened the audit log before he opened his email. That was the sequence. It had been the sequence for years, and he had never seen a reason to change it. The first indication that something had shifted came on a Tuesday in late October, and it did not arrive as a confrontation or a revelation. It arrived as a discrepancy in a timestamp. Marcus was reviewing the intake log for a batch of internal transfer documentation when he noticed that a set of files had been marked as received at 6:14 in the morning, well before building access was possible for non-executive staff. The files themselves were unremarkable. 3 pages of standard allocation paperwork for a mid-size fund rebalancing. But the timestamp did not align with any credentialed entry, and the name attached to the intake field was his own. Marcus looked at the entry for a moment, then moved his cursor to the next item in the log and continued working. He did not flag it. He did not ask anyone about it. He opened a secondary window and began pulling the access logs for that date from the building management interface, which he had credentials for as part of his role. The access logs showed nothing before 7:43. He noted the gap, closed the window, and returned to the queue. He had learned over years of audit work that the first instance of something unusual was rarely the thing itself. It was usually the edge of something larger, and edges were best understood by looking at the shape they belonged to. Over the following 3 weeks, Marcus said nothing and changed nothing about his routine. He continued arriving at 10 minutes to 8. He continued opening the audit log before his email. But he had added a step that no one watching him would have noticed because it happened inside a system they did not know he was monitoring. Each morning, after opening the audit log, he ran a quiet comparison between the intake timestamps and the building access records. He had written the script himself, a few lines of query logic that pulled from 2 databases and returned any instance where a document was logged before a credentialed entry. The script was saved locally, not on the shared drive, and it ran in a terminal window that he minimized as soon as the output appeared. By the end of the 3rd week, he had 17 instances, all of them attributed to his own credentials, all of them outside of building access hours. The documents were varied: rebalancing memos, allocation adjustments, 1 amendment to a fund prospectus, nothing that would trigger an alert on its own. But the pattern was consistent, and patterns, in Marcus's experience, were the only reliable form of evidence. He understood by then what was happening, or at least the shape of it. Someone with access to his login credentials was entering documents into the audit intake system before building hours, using his name to authenticate them. The documents were being inserted cleanly without raising flags because they fell within normal operational categories. What made the pattern visible was the timestamp gap, and that gap was only visible if you were comparing 2 systems that were not designed to be compared. Marcus had access to both because his role required it, but the comparison itself was something no one had asked him to do, and no one would have thought to check. He spent 1 evening at home reviewing the fund prospectus amendment that had been logged under his credentials. The amendment had changed the fee distribution schedule for a mid-tier fund by adjusting the calculation basis from net asset value to committed capital, a technical change with material consequences for the fund's performance fees. The adjustment was small enough to pass without triggering a review threshold, but over a 5-year cycle, it would redirect a significant amount in fee income from limited partners to the management entity. Marcus folded the copy he had printed and placed it inside a plain manila folder, which he set on the right side of his desk before going to bed. The question of who held his credentials was not one Marcus could answer directly, but he could narrow the field by working with what the system already contained. Access to his login was possible through the IT provisioning interface, which maintained a shadow copy of all active credentials for administrative recovery purposes. That interface was not widely accessible. 3 people held provisioning rights within the firm: the head of IT infrastructure, the deputy compliance officer, and the chief operating officer. Of those 3, only the deputy compliance officer had regular operational exposure to the documents being inserted into the intake queue. That was Richard Solano, a man who had joined Varden 4 years earlier from a mid-market private equity firm with a reputation for operational discipline. Solano was organized and precise in his language, and he was rarely visible in the office before mid-morning, a window that aligned consistently with the insertion timestamps Marcus had been logging. Marcus did not write any of this down as a conclusion. He recorded it in the same plain text document where he kept his timestamp comparisons, framed as a question rather than a finding, and he returned to the audit log the following morning as if the question had not been asked. Marcus had a standing quarterly meeting with the external audit liaison, a procedural touchpoint that both parties treated as routine. He sat across from Patricia Osei, a senior reviewer from the firm's external accounting partner, and worked through the standard checklist without deviation or elaboration. Near the end of the meeting, he mentioned without particular emphasis that he had recently begun running internal comparisons between document intake timestamps and building access records as part of an informal data quality initiative, and that he expected to discuss the methodology with her team at the next scheduled cycle. Patricia made a note in the margin of her checklist and asked no follow-up questions. Marcus did not offer any. He returned to his desk after the meeting, opened the audit log, and continued working through the morning queue. He had not lied about anything, and he had not made any accusation. What he had done was place a single factual line into an external record noted by an independent party without drawing attention to why that line had been placed there or what it would mean later. The external record now existed. That was sufficient. The fund in question was structured as a limited partnership, which meant its terms were governed by a partnership agreement that had been executed at the time of formation. Marcus located the original agreement through the document management system and read the fee calculation section with the kind of attention that he normally reserved for intake comparisons. The original language was clear. Performance fees were calculated on net asset value, applied at the end of each fiscal year. The amendment that had been logged under his credentials proposed changing that calculation to committed capital, a different base that produced a different number and served a different party. For the change to be effective, it needed to appear in the official fund documentation and pass through compliance review without objection. The intake log showed that it had been received and processed. The review queue showed that it had been cleared. Marcus was listed as the intake officer on both records. He requested a copy of the original prospectus from the legal document repository and placed it next to the amendment on his desk. He did not open either folder yet. He sat for a moment looking at the 2 documents side by side, then turned back to his monitor and continued with the day's remaining queue. He spent 2 evenings reading, not the documents themselves, but the regulatory framework that governed them. He had access to the firm's legal database as part of his compliance role, and he used it the way he used everything else, methodically, without rushing toward a conclusion before the structure was fully understood. What he found was not a loophole. It was a procedure. Under the fund's governing jurisdiction, any amendment to the core fee structure of a limited partnership required written acknowledgement from at least one limited partner representative, and that acknowledgement was to be retained in the fund's official record. The acknowledgement did not need to take the form of a formal signature. It could be a letter, an email, or a documented conversation summary, provided it was filed with the fund administrator within 30 days of the amendment's effective date. Marcus checked the fund administrator's records through the portal his role gave him access to. There was no acknowledgement on file. The 30-day window had closed 11 days ago. He noted the date in a plain text document saved locally, closed the legal database, and went to make tea. He did not return to the desk that evening. There is a particular quality to the stillness that arrives after a long process of observation reaches the point where everything necessary has been found. It is not relief, and it is not satisfaction. It is something closer to the settling of weight, the moment when a structure becomes complete enough to bear what will be placed on it. Marcus stood at the window of his apartment that evening and looked at the street below, without focusing on anything in particular. A bus moved through the intersection. A man with a dog waited at the corner, looking in the direction the bus had gone. The light was the flat gray that cities produce in late autumn, the kind that makes distances look shorter than they are and makes everything appear to be waiting for something it does not expect. He remained at the window for several minutes. He was aware of what he had found and aware of what he had not yet done, and he understood that the distance between those two things was where the remaining work would happen. He returned to the desk after a while and opened the legal database again, not to search for anything new, but to verify what he already believed he knew. When he had confirmed it, he closed the laptop, left the folder on the desk, and did not look at it again before morning. The following morning, Marcus arrived at 10 minutes to 8. He placed his bag on the left side of the desk. He opened the audit log. He ran the comparison script and reviewed its output. Then he did something he had not done before in the course of this process. He submitted a formal internal query to the document management system requesting a complete audit trail for the fund prospectus amendment, including all access events, modification timestamps, and the full credential log associated with the document's history in the system. The query was submitted through the standard compliance channel and would be processed by the IT infrastructure team in the normal course of operations. It would also generate an automatic system notification to any administrative user who held governance rights over the document in question. Marcus was aware of this. He submitted the query without adjusting its scope or its routing, and then returned to the intake queue and worked through the morning's remaining filings without any variation in pace or manner. The query itself was not an accusation. It was a procedure, and every compliance officer in his position had the authority to initiate it. But it would arrive in Richard Solano's notification feed before noon, and it would tell him that someone had examined that document carefully enough to trace its entire history inside the system. Richard Solano reviewed his notifications at 11:47. Marcus had no direct visibility into that moment, but the document access log recorded what followed it. At 11:49, 2 minutes after the notification would have been delivered to Solano's queue, his credentials were used to open the fund prospectus amendment in the document management system. The session lasted 6 minutes and 14 seconds. No edits were made, no comments were added, no version was saved. The document was closed, and the credential record showed no further activity on that file for the remainder of the day. Marcus reviewed the access log that evening as part of his routine audit coordination duties, which gave him full visibility into the record. 6 minutes of reading with no responsive action was, in itself, a piece of information. A person who had filed the document through proper channels and had nothing to conceal would have had little reason to sit with it for that duration. A person calculating the scope of what had been seen would need exactly that kind of time. Marcus noted the session timestamp, the duration, and the absence of any recorded action. He entered it into his plain text log, filed his daily record, and left the building at his usual time without speaking to anyone about it. 3 days later, Marcus received an email from the fund administrator's office, addressed to him in his capacity as the intake officer of record for the amendment. The email asked him to confirm receipt of a limited partner acknowledgement letter that had apparently been submitted to the administrator by fax on the day before the 30-day window had closed. The letter, the email explained, had been uploaded to the fund's official document portal and was now on file. Marcus opened the administrator's portal and located the letter. It was a single page, formatted correctly, carrying the right date and bearing a signature attributed to a named representative at one of the fund's limited partner firms. He printed it and placed it in the manila folder. Then he opened the external fax log system, which the firm maintained for all inbound compliance correspondence and which he had access to through his coordination role. He searched for inbound faxes on the date listed on the letter. The log returned 4 entries for that day. The acknowledgement letter was not among them. He checked adjacent dates as a precaution. It was not there either. The fax log was time-stamped automatically by the receiving hardware, and its records could not be edited through any standard user credential. If the fax had arrived, it would be in the log. It was not. He sat with that finding for a long moment before doing anything further. The absence of a fax record was not by itself conclusive, but it was specific in the way that only a system-generated gap could be. The letter claimed to have been transmitted by fax on a date that the receiving hardware had no record of, which meant the letter had most likely been created after the fact and uploaded directly to the administrator's portal, bypassing the fax system entirely and using the portal's document submission function to place it into the official record without a corresponding transmission log. Marcus looked again at the signature block at the bottom of the printed letter. The name belonged to a representative at a limited partner firm whose contact information was publicly listed on their website under Investor Relations. He drafted a short, factual email from his external compliance address, introduced himself by role and firm, referenced the fund by name and the document by date, and asked whether the representative's office could confirm whether any communication had been sent to Varden Capital during that period regarding the fee structure amendment. He reviewed the email once, made no changes, and sent it before noon. He then returned to the intake queue and continued working without any further reference to what he had just done. The reply arrived the following afternoon while Marcus was midway through the intake queue. He read it once at his desk without stopping what he was doing, then printed it and read it again. The representative confirmed clearly that no such letter had been sent, that her firm had not been contacted by anyone at Varden Capital regarding any amendment to the fund's fee calculation structure, and that she was forwarding the inquiry to their legal counsel as a precautionary measure in light of the documentation that had apparently been filed in their name. Marcus set the printed reply on top of the folder without comment. He then gathered each item he had accumulated over the preceding weeks: the original prospectus, the amendment, the timestamp comparison records, the regulatory procedure note, the fax log comparison showing the absence of any matching transmission, and the representative's written denial. He arranged them in chronological order and tabbed each section. He placed a single handwritten page at the front summarizing the sequence of events in plain language, dated and initialed. He closed the folder and set it on the right side of his desk. He did not open it again before the following morning. Marcus requested an appointment with the firm's general counsel through the formal scheduling system, listing the subject as a compliance matter requiring legal review and attaching nothing to the request. The appointment was confirmed for 2 days later, a Thursday morning at 9. In the intervening time, Marcus continued his regular duties without variation. He reviewed the intake queue each morning, ran the comparison script, filed his daily log, and attended the 2 standing meetings that fell within that period without raising anything outside their standard agendas. On Thursday, he arrived at 10 minutes to 8, completed his opening sequence, and at 5 minutes to 9, placed the manila folder in his bag and took the elevator to the 17th floor. He set the folder on the table between himself and the general counsel, opened it to the summary page, and said nothing further. He had prepared the summary to be read, not explained, and he waited while she read it. She moved through each tabbed section without asking questions. When she reached the last page, she looked up. Marcus looked back at her with the same expression he had carried through every morning of the preceding weeks. He had nothing to add, and she did not ask him to. What followed moved through channels that were above Marcus's operational level, but the system he worked within made parts of it visible as a matter of routine. Over the 2 weeks after his meeting with the general counsel, he could see the shape of what was happening through the access logs and document records that passed through his coordination queue. External legal counsel accessed the fund documentation on 3 separate occasions during the first week, each session longer than the last. The limited partner firm's legal team submitted a formal inquiry to the fund administrator, which generated an automatic document hold on all records related to the amendment and its associated filings. The IT infrastructure team initiated a credential audit on the provisioning system, a request that was routed through Marcus's queue as a standard compliance item, which was how he came to see it. Richard Solano's shared calendar, visible to all users through the firm's scheduling system, showed 3 consecutive days of blocked time with no listed participants or subject lines, followed by a half-day entry marked only as HR consultation. Marcus noted each of these items as they appeared in front of him. He did not search for anything beyond what the system surfaced through its ordinary operation, and he made no record of any of it outside the standard daily log. 6 weeks after Marcus had placed the folder on the general counsel's table, a notice arrived in his intake queue from the fund administrator's office. It was addressed to all parties of record for the fund and stated that the prospectus amendment filed in the prior quarter was being formally rescinded on the basis of a procedural deficiency in the amendment process. The notice confirmed that the original fee calculation terms, based on net asset value, remained in effect and would continue to govern the fund's performance fee structure for the remainder of its term. It did not name any individual. It did not describe the nature of the deficiency or the process by which it had been identified. It was a single paragraph in the kind of administrative language that exists to close matters without reopening them. Marcus read it when it appeared in the queue, logged it under the correct fund reference, filed it in the appropriate records folder, and updated the intake log with the standard notation. He noticed, without attaching any particular meaning to it, that the notice had arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week as the timestamp discrepancy that had been the first indication anything was wrong. He completed the entry, moved to the next item in the queue, and continued. The manila folder had been transferred to the general counsel's records at her request, and Marcus's desk had returned to its usual arrangement. The audit log open on the left monitor, the intake queue on the right, his bag placed on the left side of the desk where it had always been. The compliance department was quiet at that hour. The same low gray carpet, the same flat light from the windows, the same building that had been designed to feel permanent. Marcus sat in the chair he had occupied for 11 years and looked at the screens in front of him. The system continued exactly as it had before any of this had begun. Documents arrived, were checked against the required criteria, and were filed. The intake log filled incrementally, one entry at a time. The comparison script ran each morning and returned its output, which he reviewed and closed. Nothing in the process had changed, and nothing about his place within it had changed either. But his understanding of what the process was doing had shifted in a way that was difficult to locate precisely. He had always thought of the system as a record, a neutral apparatus for documenting what had already occurred. He understood it differently now. It was a surface, and if you knew how to read it, it showed you everything that had been pressed against it, including the things that had been designed to leave no mark at all. He opened the first item in the queue, reviewed it against the intake criteria, and filed it.